Good morning and good afternoon around the world. I'm sure that we have a lot of people joining from the UK, but I think we have quite a few people, perhaps early doors in the States and perhaps late doors in Asia. So thank you so much for joining us today. And we'd love you, if you can, drop a quick comment, quick hello in the chat if you would like to say who you are, where you're joining from around the world. It would be lovely to see you. But we'll kick off because we have a power 45 minutes ahead of us. It's a really hot day here in the UK for many of us, I'm sure. So we'll get going. A very warm welcome to Boards, a World in Flux, as we're live on LinkedIn today with the one and only great friend, amazing board guru extraordinaire, Patrick Dunne. Hello, Patrick. Great to be here together.
Yeah, great to be here. I'm actually at Cranfield today. I've just been doing a non-exec program session on behavioural dynamics, so I'm completely in the zone. Yeah.
I love it. In the zone, exactly, as we should be. Fantastic. I'm Rebecca Robbins. I'm sure there are many of you that Patrick and I know on the call, but for those of you who don't know us, I've had the privilege of knowing and working with Patrick for many years. I head up a consultancy in high-performing leadership and education, and Patrick and I have also written another book together, which is 5 Generations at Work, but we're here today, and I'm really excited about it. I'm a big aficionado of Patrick's book, Boards, which came out a few years ago, but specifically we're here today to talk through the brand new edition number 3. So I hope you get a sense of the tone of today. It's guaranteed to be high energy and hopefully high impact. Most importantly, and we see comments coming in already, and hellos from Ngozi and Melanie, lovely to see you both. Once we've got underway, we're going to get underway with about 20 minutes or so of conversation and getting into some of the meaty issues. We'd very much invite comments and questions in the chat. So with that, Patrick, if you're willing, let's get started. And I'd like to take everyone back, if we could, to the world of boards and governance and the big why. What is it that first got you interested in boards?
Well, I was an early stage growth capital investor at 3i very early on in my career, and I inherited a workout portfolio to manage, and I went to probably what's still the champion worst board meeting I'd been to. Totally dysfunctional situation, and I started to think about, how could you do this better? What makes a good board? What makes a good board member? How should a board work with the executive team? And I talked to my boss about this, and we were clear that actually throughout that time we weren't as thoughtful as we might be about those things, and we could do with training. We could do with having some more principles around that stuff, and more sort of good plumbing as well to go with that. And we changed a hell of a lot at that time. We changed a lot around how we appointed people, our own people, giving them training before they went on boards rather than sort of after, and so on. And it made a big difference. So that's really what got me into the whole board thing. It was a moment nearly of observing something and thinking, actually, it could be better. And it was a naive moment. I didn't have a lot of experience at the time. Who was I to sort of pontificate on this? So I think that helped a lot, because the approach was, what can we learn from the people who are good at this? What can we do if we think about these particular aspects and break it down and more or less system think it, rather than just freewheel and go along with current practice. So that was really it. Yeah.
I love that. That's something really powerful in what you said about, a naive moment that inspired it, to the power of systems thinking, again, and the best practice that we see here today. And what's wonderful thank you again for the people who've shared where they're joining from, who they are. Please keep that going. It's lovely to see everyone on today. I think what's testament to that is how many programs, of course, you've run over the years in terms of, bringing this best practice to so many. And as we think about boards, the world in flux, I mean, what's really poignant about this is that flux part, because flux is now the new norm, the new normal. Just thinking through, what's on everyone's minds, and again, we'll get into the questions in about 20 minutes or so. That will mean the same things to a lot of us on this call. It will mean different things to others. But just again, perhaps if we look at the past decade, Patrick, we've seen a lot of change, some of it quite seismic. Could you pick out, the biggest changes that you've seen around boards over that last decade?
I think there's been a number of big seismic things. So I think the whole geopolitical environment has led to increased uncertainty, increased volatility, all the things people have written about. And some boards have been very progressive, other boards are catching up with the implication of that for decision making. The old ways of classic budgeting and strategy that don't really work in the current environment. So we need more dynamic budgeting. We need other approaches there. I think culturally a lot has changed in the world in terms of the way that people think, understand, and we've got the thing that we're very bonded over the intergenerational stuff around that too. I think the expectations of people who are in leadership positions have changed. I think technologically things are very different, and the if you can use technological tools to advance, if you can use technological tools to inform, augment decision making, those are good. I think also there's been a kind of societal change as well, and the role of business in society, or the role of charities in society, or government, or whatever the context is for your board. I think things have been changing quite dramatically. And then of course the instant communication of knowledge. So you need to be aware that you do one thing, it's you need to consider that pretty well everything is public, and or it could be within minutes. And so and also that world conversation about a particular topic as opposed to the way things used to be. And I think that's accelerated in the last 10 years. I don't think it started in the last 10 years. I think many of these things have just become more pronounced and more exaggerated in that time. But the challenges for boards are to actually do what's in the best interest of the organization and to maximize the potential of the organization. I don't think that's gone away. I think one challenge of the current environment is that there's so many risks, so many dangers, so many challenges. It's easy to lose sight of the opportunity. It's easy to lose sight of maximizing potential, and what we're trying to do is minimize uncertainty, risk, and so on. So I think the environment, there's a lot going on, and that's one of the reasons I thought it was time for a new edition.
And I think that maximizing mindset, again, we've talked a lot about that in so many contexts. But I think there are two things obviously converging here in terms of, as you say, the seismic shifts and the context over the past decade. But I think that why now, that timing, I think you seem to have really landed it in terms of the response that it's getting. Talk us through, if you could. And again, I've devoured obviously both editions already, but what's new for you, if you could summarize that for those who haven't read it yet, Patrick, because of course there is, what's exciting for those of us who do love the case studies and unpacking the live dilemmas, there's a ton of new dilemmas which we'll get into in a second, but macro, big picture, what's new for people, and how does that meet the why now?
Yeah, and the first point was I thought there was a lot I wanted to say. There's a lot of things going on. On AI was an obvious thing. On these things we've just been discussing around the way that we take decisions, on composition. So that I had a lot of things I wanted to sort of say that were different. Things have moved on, and I thought because I think the second edition was a fairly meaty thing, and I thought I was conscious of the weight of it, physically, and I thought, well, I need to create some space for the new things I wanted to say. And I had some new dilemmas, and the dilemmas were really popular in the other edition. So I thought, and then at heart as well, I thought, why would anyone want to buy a new edition of a book that particularly they've already got? So I thought, actually, I've got a sort of responsibility really to make it sufficiently different that it might be worth investing in. So I decided I'd put 11 of the 13 dilemmas that were in the previous edition just completely free on my website, and that created quite a lot of space to put. There's 4 sections in the book, which are they're called the same sections as the previous edition: purpose, people, process, and dilemmas. And that gave me space in all the various different elements to say things. For example, there's quite a decent bit around the way we think about risk. I think the way we think about risk needs to change. I think the way that audit and risk committees operate needs to change. That might be a more of a kind of processy type thing, but it's quite strategic. AI and the use of technology clearly is another thing. I think the rise of next gen boards again, which we bonded over, I thought there should be more on that. And actually, one of the new dilemmas is exactly about that. A next gen board that's got off to a cracking start, and then it's all gone horribly wrong. And how do you put it back together again? So I think there's new in all sections. So also quite a lot of things just needed updating. It's not code heavy because you've got a link and you can go and have a look at the code, but I've made comments on some of the more recent things as well. There's some new things around the I've mentioned decision making around some of the behavioral dynamics as well. I think some of that's there's some new things I've sort of learnt and from others, and so I've sort of hopefully captured some of those reasonably well. So it's not like here's the old bit and here's the new bit. I literally went through every sentence and tested whether that deserved to be there in my quest to create space. And I deleted some bits and have made room for sufficiently significant amount of new stuff, really.
I think, risk, I'd love to, again, when we get into the conversation and Q&A with everyone online, that comes up time and time again, doesn't it? When you hear chairs talking through, whether it's cyber attacks, really, really big issues that have come up, the double-edged sword of that risk radar. And things being present on there, but actually, how we leaning into that. And I love, again, your framing of maximizing versus minimizing, because risk inherently takes us to that place of minimizing, but actually the maximizing mindset does something very different.
Yeah, and I think, one of the expressions which does seem to have resonated is, I think we spend too much time worrying and not enough time thinking about risk. I think we worry a lot about things which might happen, but what we really need to do is be thinking through how we manage, how we can, if it's within our control, reduce the probability of that risk. But most importantly, like you take cyber, I think a good example, a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about how they minimize the risk, and that's right. But not enough boards have simulated the board meeting that they will have when they do get a cyber attack. What will you actually do when that happens?
I love that. And again, getting into the simulations. And that's where I think the dilemmas are really helpful, Patrick, because for those who haven't read any of the editions of Patrick's board book yet, what is beautiful about the dilemmas is that they read exactly like that. You feel as though you're in the board meeting, you're in the one-on-one coffees. So again, I think there's something quite magical about how you brought that to life. See questions coming in. Alice, I'm going to come to yours in a few minutes if I can. That's in that comment. Thank you for that. You touch on something that is, I think, very important and powerful when we think also about the biggest demographic shift in history that we are living and working through, and what that really means. But on the dilemmas, Patrick, again, it's always hard to say. There are your favorites, I'm sure. I'd love to kick us off if we can we unpack a couple with you right now? There's one that is a particular favorite of mine, and I remember an article that you wrote a couple of years ago called Maps to Satnav, and I'm just thrilled to see Maps to Satnav as one of the dilemmas. It's one of my favorites. I wonder if you can just walk people through Maps to Satnav.
Yeah, I was stuck on the M6 in the UK on the way to see my mum up in Liverpool, and I was struck. I was just thinking about a board meeting and thinking, the maps world for me was one defined by the very rigorous, detailed annual budget, the 5-year strategic plan, where you knew what you were pretty well going to be doing in September 3 years from now. And I was thinking how helpful the SatNav was that day. I was thinking, actually, as a board, maybe we ought to have a SatNav mindset than a maps mindset, where we don't have these sort of more dated, timed sort of things, but they're more dynamic. I've always been a big fan of dynamic budgeting, for example, but there's a lot you need to do to make that work. And so I started to think about, how could you make strategic decisions which had more flexibility within them, more capability to be agile. How could you, in terms of your budget? So, for example, if you're overperforming, you're just going to bank that, or are you going to use it earlier rather than wait to the end of the year? So, for example, at Royal Voluntary Service, we use that principle where we for a period we were generating more unrestricted reserves or surplus than we thought. So what do? Do you invest half, bank half, rebuild your reserves, or do you rebuild your reserves completely? What do you do? And some things actually, you almost invariably are going to over or underperform a certain item, and you can almost predetermine what you will do if that happens. So the company, the example I was thinking about at the time was Zoom during the early COVID years, how they used dynamic budgeting and dynamic strategic processes to capitalize on the advantage that they had through that situation, and I that's what that's about. So the maps to SatNav dilemma is where you've got a board meeting and they've used an element of dynamic budgeting and strategic decision making, and things have stabilized a bit for that company, and you've got one of the non-execs, a more traditional person who's saying, oh well, we can get back to doing it the way we used to do now, and there's a reaction against that, and there's a bit of a bust up over that, and it's how you navigate through that. And also you can't just imagine you're going to do this without thinking about what capabilities, what capacity you need. And sometimes where people have tried this, the exec have really embraced it, got on with it, and love it. But you've got sometimes board members who feel uncomfortable with it. They maybe felt comfortable that it's quite easy to judge how management were performing if they're on budget, they're not on budget, they're meeting the strategic milestones or not. The world we're in at the moment, where there's so many external influences, it's not that straightforward anymore. And so they might overperform because of a technological trend or something that's they didn't inspire, they didn't do, they've taken advantage of it. But you ask yourself, are we really maximizing the advantage we've got on that? We might be up 30% on last year, but could it have been 50? And that kind of thing. And again, on the downside protection, I think strengthening the core, just as with Pilates or our sort of human body, is as important to do for an organization. What can we do? We might not know what the things which might come along and hit us are, but we know we're going to get hit with something. You look at the last couple of years here in the UK or anywhere, and so how can we make sure we are as resilient as we could be, for things that might come along and hit us in whatever way.
Brilliant. And again, as I said, maps to SatNav is one of my favorite dilemmas, so do tap that up. I think so 4 or 5 minutes, Patrick, if I may, before then we really start taking some questions. So please, if you have questions, feel free to questions, comments, observations, anything that you'd like to double down on with Patrick, that would be great. But I think, Patrick, one of your favorite dilemmas, or one of the ones that you see as most in demand?
The DEI or DIE one has been, so far, I've, the number of calls or people saying, actually, can you come and talk to us about it? That's been one. So DEI DIE is a kind of situation where a company has been really quite progressive around its DEI agenda and the way it's done things, and it felt it's got real value from that. It's a public company. It's about to go and do its quarterly results roadshow in the US, and there's an understandable input from the brokers and the investor relations team who've gathered feedback, and people saying, well, we saying, well, we can't mention that anymore. We will lose investors. And there's a reaction against that, in terms of saying, but that's who we are. That makes us money. That's a really good thing. Why would we not? And there's a bit of a bust up. There's one of the non-execs who sort of almost like coming out saying, oh, thank goodness, at least we can drop all this woke stuff and get on with it. and there's a reaction against that. So it's this chain reaction in the board room with the CEO, with the head of investor relations. But at the end of the day, the board has to decide really with the management, what are the messages we want to communicate in our investor relations roadshow. And as someone who's done a lot of that historically, I know how that feels like. But we how do we be true to ourselves, and how do we not score an own goal in terms of losing business, losing contracts? So there's pragmatic realities. So and it's all about how they navigate through that situation where there's things which have been unsaid, things which people have been thinking but they haven't spoken, which come out, and the board isn't evidently as united as it actually thought it probably was, and the CEO is incensed by the discussion and some of the things that are said in it, and so there's conflict. So it's a good dilemma because I think it's quite current. It's got some common conflict management sort of challenge within it as well, and I think a lot of people have been wrestling with this. And many companies are, and actually for many people within a company, they've seen their CEOs pirouette less than gracefully from one position that they were saying they absolutely believed in with very high conviction to completely the opposite. And I think they've seen some of the churn rates rise significantly, particularly amongst the younger generations, as a consequence, because people are saying, well, I thought I believed in this, and they don't. They were just saying it, and they're probably just saying this now. So what can we believe that they say? So you've got all that going on, and I think it's a good one because it's a genuine dilemma. And if you made a choice at either end of the spectrum in that issue, you're probably going to have trouble. So you need to find a path. What is that path, and how can you then realign the board behind something when there's been this fissure open up?
Yeah, and I think that's another thing to point out is that the dilemmas are all examples of real world action. That again, individual examples, obviously all ghosted, but I think representing a whole body of wider evidence behind. So really interesting to see your level of demand for DEI or die. Love the almost symmetry in that, Patrick. I know knowing your mathematical brain, I can see how you've named and framed that.
My other favourite is there's one about Horizon World, Next Gen World gone wrong, but the one the other one that's been really popular is the called Fastest Not Bestest, but it's about a merger acquisition that's gone horribly wrong, and how do you recover from that? And it's gone horribly wrong for a number of reasons, and the regulators got involved, and it's really it's challenging. But that's quite fun.
Oh, great. Well, perfect timing, because again, this is fantastic. So we've got 20 minutes to go, everyone. So exactly what we wanted to start opening out into comments and questions. I'm going to come back to Alison, your comment in a minute, if I may, because Paul, welcome, Paul. Hi, Paul. Lovely to see you. You've chimed in with, again, building on your DEI or die, continuing on the theme of diversity, Patrick. How do you think diversity has strengthened boards since the first edition of the book? So that's tracking back a few years now. Just can we remind everyone the year that came out?
2000.
Yeah.
Well, I think when you look at diversity, actually, I think it's inclusion that you really need to be talking about. So because diversity is really a demographic. So I think the demographics of boards have changed in some ways. So probably the most progress of the issues around gender, I think we've probably gone backwards on social diversity, which is a really terrible thing, really. I think disabled, very poor progress been made on that, and race negligible. So I'm not sure that diversity of boards in those areas has changed a lot. I think the generational diversity has changed quite a bit, particularly with the rise of a lot of tech companies. So I think they're there. The rise of next gen boards has helped a lot, I think. So, you've probably got the chair of that board on the main board. So I think the strengths are diversity of thought. So no matter what the particular dimension of it is dimension of thought. And I think in a world which, shouty, noisy people can dominate, I think I've seen, a number of chairs there's a few more introverts on boards now, which I think is a really good, helpful thing. Have people there who are thinking while other people are talking is really quite helpful. So I'm a big believer in it. But yeah, and there's more written on that in the book. But I know there's a number of other questions. So.
Well, and again, I'd like to pair some of these up actually, because, and again, Paul, would love also your lens in terms of what you've seen perhaps in the past 5-6 years ago. So perhaps we can come back to a comment later on that. And I think I'd like to pivot to Alison. Thank you for being patient, and also for, I think, that first comment, because you talked about you've actually enjoyed bringing, and I want to play this back for everyone, Patrick, bringing younger voices into the boardrooms and bringing future customers with us that matters. I mean, as Patrick mentioned, one of the things that brought us together, we've both been huge advocates of more multi-generational boards and next generation boards in the process as accelerators and amplifiers of talent. So, I mean, it is interesting, as you say, Patrick, because we're both noting and charting the rise of next generation boards. And that's going to that's really going to start to kick in terms of shifting up, or rather shifting the age of board members, which really hasn't shifted from where it's stuck for the past number of years. But, if we've got 5 generations that work for the first time, we've got 5 generations of customers, why are we not listening to? Why are we not seeking to inform? So I think, Alison, you've raised a brilliant build there. I don't know if you've got examples that you wanted to share, but I think what Alison's bridging brilliantly, Patrick, is that notion of, this far beyond the tokenistic younger voice in the room, actually being much more intentional about why those people are there, and also more sustainable trajectories.
Yeah. So I think the 3 reasons I found value in them, and I've been, even with 20 years or more, it is you get it's the extra insight. It's the different type of challenge. And also, I think there's a degree now of increased legitimacy that can come. You with your staff, with your suppliers, with your customers, with everybody else, the next gen term can be used in multiple ways. So I think there are lots of these next gen boards that aren't called next gen board. They might be called a horizon board because they're forward looking. If I think of, one of my favorites is the Port of Tyne up in the northeast, because they have a next gen board, but it's a multi-generational next gen board. They're thinking about the word next gen in the context of the next generation of the port, not kind of like the younger generation. I think there are many tips on making these work, and I think it isn't all about younger. It's interesting. The Mars company has a very good process, where it has multi-generational groups on things, and they find real value on that. A live example that we've just been creating. We're calling it the Futures Council at the Royal Voluntary Service, and there are 3 million volunteers short in the UK, which is a problem. There are lots of people who want to volunteer but don't know how, and they don't have access to volunteering opportunities. But we want to change the demographic of volunteers in the UK, which is currently in the older groups, which is fantastic, and we don't want to lose any of that. We want to want more, but actually we want to create more volunteers. So our GoVo platform, for example, you can volunteer. Some of the volunteering opportunities go down as young as 14 at the moment. We want them to be lower, but there are challenges around that, which you obviously appreciate. But and a good way to do that is get a group of people who really understand the way that young people live their lives, understand how to communicate with them, understand what will be attractive, what won't be, and it's fresh, it's new. But that's really good. And also in terms of our younger staff, it's giving legitimacy that, it's not just a group of people of my generation making decisions on the board. In fact, we have a multi-generational board. So they feel more, whether right or not is another matter, but they feel more confident that there's a group of people who might understand how they think and feel and want things. I think that's how I'd answer that.
Well, I love that. And again, closing off on this before I go to a couple of other questions that have come in, I think it comes back to exactly what you said at the beginning, Patrick, which is all of this is maximizing the business strategy. This is not a project or initiative on the side. It's actually threading it through. I know the Gucci example that's in 5 Generations at Work was a really powerful example of what happened in a 5 to 6 year period, because this was better connecting employee experience and customer experience at one of the most successful times in history. So it's another example of corporate next generation boards. So thank you for that, Alison. Thank you for, I think we could double down on that for a long time. It's a brilliant question and a lot to unpack. I'd like to power through, conscious of time. Let's get into risk if we can. I don't know who LinkedIn user is on risk, but thank you, LinkedIn user on risk. Some people's names are not coming up, but I wonder if we can go to that one, Patrick, because it goes back to what you and I were talking about earlier on about the register as governance backbone. And again, this supplementing it with scenario planning, simulation, wargaming, etc. Can you talk a bit more on that? Because again, we wanted to get into risk a little bit more.
Yeah. So, and you start it with the register, and that's particularly resonant with me because I'm dyslexic, and I find, these very colourful risk registers where the font size of 4 really challenging. I think also often many risk registers are about events like this happening, that happening, whereas actually we need to be thinking more about consequences. The reason I feel strongly about, I think all boards need to have a sit down and a reflection about how do we think about risk, how do we manage risk, is I think audit and risk are generally combined. Some regulators want them separate, but often they're combined. And the composition of audit and risk committees tends to be financially oriented people, and tends to be you would think that older may be wiser, but not always people doing that. And I've had great experience at 3i when I was chairing our own operational risk committee of swapping out a few of the more experienced, highly regarded people in the company for some younger, more rebellious types. And I think we learned a lot from doing that. So I think there's something around the composition of risk committees or audit and risk committees that thing. I think the wargaming simulation, I spend quite a bit of time, actually, interestingly, most of it outside the UK, doing board simulations for people. So that might be about a big strategic decision we think we might have to take in soonish. So let's just rehearse the issues. It might be about an external threat, which cyber's the obvious one, but not always. There can be other things. There might be a regulatory change. There might be something else like that. Actually, you can do simulations around succession planning. It's quite interesting, those sort of things. In the chemical industry where I started my life, after graduating, we're very used to doing simulations of things blowing up and things not working and so on. So it's maybe more ingrained. But I think that thought, just going through the process, getting to feel as close as you can in terms of the pressure that you're under. And I think a rehearsal is a really good thing. But the more real you can make it, the better. I've also found it's been a good way of testing people's capacity, capability under pressure. I think we all found, I remember particularly when the Lehman's crisis, because I remember that very deeply, the effect that had, and thinking it's amazing how some of the non-execs were just incredible in terms of their calm, their resilience, their thoughtfulness, their thinking around what we might do and how we might do it, and thinking other people who before I might have thought actually they're fantastic, they're really very eloquent on topics, but they weren't so good in that situation. And I think there's a difference when it bites for real, for sure. But if you can go most of the way to real, you find out a lot about your colleagues, and you find out actually we haven't got anyone who, you'll find there might be a gap. So I'm a big fan of wargaming and simulations. But what you mustn't do is analyze and simulate your way to nothing because you're not doing anything in the real world. So you need to combine those things.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, again, thank you. And please feel free. LinkedIn user on risk, if you'd like to identify yourself or share more of your thoughts on that, that would be fantastic. Thank you. There are I think some 3 other sort of big topics emerging here, and we've got 10 minutes left, Patrick. So good time to go through each of them. I'll kick off with, I'm putting 3 together here on AI, 2 for people I can't see your names and LinkedIn users, but I think there's one that's come from Nicola Watkinson, who talks about how ensuring we have the right level of understanding across the group. There's another which is just generally interested in AI related dilemmas in your book, and another proof point here just around, and again then there are different stats, and I know you're benching this, Patrick, again the percentage of boards that are just simply not discussing, engaging with the impact of AI and its contribution to their effectiveness. So could we spend perhaps 3 or 4 minutes on unpacking 2 or 3 of those under the big AI bucket?
Massive topic. Well,
yeah.
I suppose the first thing is, as a board, it's a bit like culture. If we're thinking about culture, because I think AI is an important ingredient in culture now. We need to know what culture we've got. We need to know what culture we want, and we need to know how to get from one to the other if they're different. And AI is a bit like that. So what AI is being used in the company at the moment, what AI might potentially and already be able to add a lot of value for what we're doing. A lot of companies have raced off. Maybe some have gone a bit early and now they're cutting back on, they thought this was going to add a lot of value. And if you remember the early days of SatNav, going back to our conversation, when we found ourselves being guided to drive through a river, we kind of, the human intervened and said, no, maybe that's not such a good idea. We're in the foothills of some of those similar things happening. But there is no doubt that AI can already be used to augment a lot of decisions, better inform us, make us more aware of the consequences through, AI simulations. So those techniques are there and they are being used, and there's some real value within those. There's a lot of, noise and a lot of wasted time, but there is real value in lots of that. I think in actual decision making from a board context, we're at the very early days of that. Lloyd's have got a bot on their board. Others, starting to go down that route. I think they're being used for informing decisions mostly, augmenting decisions. Yeah. I think there are lots of decisions which are routine. So, if you look at some of the board platforms, Board Intelligence and Diligent are probably the 2 most notable. If there's a regulatory change in a sector, you might get a warning. It'll tell you there's a regulatory bulletin. If it's got in its knowledge resource, because you put it in there, your policy around that particular issue, it can come up with a new drafting that, if you're going to comply with the new regulation or guidance, this is what you would do. Do you want to approve that or don't you? Now, that's a very big time saver. There's human intervention at the end. But that's that's an example of stuff that's already happening. If I'm a public company and I'm looking at the next quarterly announcement, I can have in the room, I can inquire of what the competitor are doing, and if they're a few weeks ahead of us in announcing, and how their roadshow's gone, and how there's lots of things about that you can do. I think the move to completely agentic AI within the organization and within board decision making is, where that's starting to happen with varying consequences. I think the one thing that I feel very strongly about is are we just converting existing processes into more efficient ones, or are we doing some things that we can do really radically different, better than we were doing before? And in all of these things are based on models, and so what are the inherent biases in those models, and what are the inherent biases of the people who are writing those models? And we've seen some hilarious examples so far of things like that. But I think boards need to understand. I was helping one board and someone presenting to the board saying, we're introducing this AI and we've had it bias tested, and no one asked, what do those bias tests test for? How do they work? And the bias testing actually in that case proved highly ineffective, and that was why they were discussing it. But you have to really probe behind a lot of the assumptions. I think, just like with anything else, you don't take everything at face value, but there's a mesmerizing quality to some of the AI tools.
And again, I love your build there in terms of the things that we could do radically better, Patrick, which again goes back to perhaps doing fewer things well, investing them and sustaining them. So I'm really curious around, what might be, and whether it's board edition 4 and a few times charting some of those examples. Great. Well, I'd like to just pivot. I'd like to bring another couple of questions together, if I may. And again, forgive me because these are LinkedIn users coming up, not everyone's name, but it's all coalescing, Patrick, around role of chair, consensus, cohesion, contribution. So if I could bring those two questions together. So there's one which is looking at, and of course, you are a chair yourself, have been a long-standing chair on many boards over the years. One, ensuring a genuine contribution from all members of the board, whilst ensuring cohesion between exec and non-exec. And this also pivots into, you've written about, again, another person has said, you've written about consensus seeking as a symptom of groupthink. So I think, again, I'd love to pair those two comments and observations together, if I may.
Yeah, and I'd link it back to culture again. I think, the culture of the board and the culture of the organization need to be, compatible with each other. And in the board, you want a culture where people can speak their mind, where they do feel free to have a different point of view. And that is one reason why, diversity will often give you that. You have to work with that. So I think, I find when I become a chair of an organization, I think that session at the very beginning where, I find it helpful to talk about how we're going to work together, how are we going to disagree? And I make the implicit assumption that we will disagree, that we will have things that we have different views, different perspectives over. But also, once we have decided, we must act, we must respect that decision. We must maximize the chances of that working. One of the things that I found that really helps with big strategic decisions to achieve all of that is to, rather than go down the traditional model of, we've got a big decision to take, let's get the management to do a paper, let's decide one wet Wednesday morning, we spend an hour on it and we decide. I think that's a very risky way to make a big decision. I quite like breaking it down into a couple of phases where you get input from people. You start to think about, how will we make the decision? What's the decision we're really taking? What information do we need? Don't get the management to guess what's in a board paper. Give them some guidance as to what we want in the board paper. They might come up with other things that they think you need that you haven't asked for, and that's fine. But I think one frustration around many boards at the moment is, board papers are too long. Well, they're often too long because the management are guessing what you want rather than having a proper conversation about that. I think the role of the chair really in getting views from people, sometimes ahead of meetings. Now, traditionally, that's been seen as a sort of Machiavellian kind of manipulative kind of thing to do. I genuinely like to do that, particularly with the introverts on the board, so I understand what they're thinking, what they want, and then maybe I can involve them more in the decision than they might otherwise have been. I might say to you, in fact, I remember the odd occasion where I said to you, Rebecca, we were on one board, actually, we were chatting the other day, you said something really interesting about this, maybe share it with everyone, we could benefit from that. I think in the disagreement, I think managing conflict is one of the defining skills, I think, of good leaders generally, but good chairs in particular. You have to have the ability to, get those different ideas out and find the way to find, what are we actually going to do? And what are we going to do that people have got conviction behind and will do? My own experience on one board was that the majority of the board wanted to do something that I thought was really not the right thing to do. It was a strategic decision. I thought we'd lose a load of money and there'd be a reputational risk. And I put up my case for that and I got overruled. And so you think, well, what do you do in that moment? Do I resign? Do I carry on? My feeling was, I don't think this is the right thing to do. But I'm seeing some of these risks much higher than others are. So my role now should be trying to help to see, by introducing people or by, whatever means, to see how we might reduce those risks, which I saw as undermining of the proposal. The reality was, within a year, the thing was going horribly wrong. And so you've got another decision to take. Do you go, ha, I told you, blah. And I think that's a terrible thing to do. What you do then again is, I think you muck in whatever way is, where you can add value, and you help get out of that hole that they're in, and you don't spend a moment saying, I told you so, or even thinking it. You've got a responsibility to act in the best interest of the organization, the company, and that's what you should be doing. It's not about you, it's about the company. So I think recruiting people with those kind of mindsets is quite important.
Well, I love that. As we on 12:45 on the dot, Patrick. I mean, what
Sorry.
precision timing there from your mathematical brain, as ever. I'd like to say a huge thank you. Well, let's round out with 3 big thank yous. First of all, Patrick, thanks so much to you. Thank you for bringing Boards Edition 3 into the world. The whole Mission Impossible franchise comes to mind in many ways. I'm excited, will we ever get to as many as the Mission Impossible franchise, which has been hugely successful. So Boards Edition 3, I mean, I absolutely adore it. It's fantastic, and I've followed all the other editions so far. So I recommend, if you haven't read it already, go and check it out. And again, order it through the brilliant governance team. And with that, also a huge thank you to 2 people you cannot see today who are on the stream, but to Leslie and to her brilliant team at Governance, who are the catalysts and orchestrators behind bringing that book into being. And then finally, thank you to everyone who, on one of the hottest days of the year and on the cusp of tennis and football and everything else tempting us into the weekend, a huge thank you for giving your time today, for sharing your reflections, your comments, and such brilliant questions. We hope it's been sparky, energizing, and edifying for all of you. It certainly has for all of us. And with that, have a great rest of your Friday and happy reading into the weekend. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Bye. Thank you.